Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining once again the special Carnegie Mellon Mumbai interview series with Harsh Gupta. My name is Ashay Doshi. I'll be running today's interview. And before we get started, thank you everyone for joining very, very early. I'll invite Rekha Koita, who is a CME Mumbai chapter president, to say a few words of welcome for Harsh as well as our attendees. Rekha.
Yeah, thank you, Ashay. And very warm welcome to all of you for joining and thank you for joining, on time on a weekday evening. And a big thank you to Harsh for agreeing to do this session and taking out so much time for us. So we're all really looking forward to hearing you. And I think just before we kind of get started, I think I just wanted to make a very quick announcement that I think probably most of you, at least those who are from CMU, know Ashay and me, I think, over the course of all these series. And as you know, I've been, running the Mumbai chapter for the last 6 years, but I think it's now time for me to, pass on the baton. So I'm really happy to announce that Ashay Doshi is going to be the next president for our Mumbai chapter. So, thank you, Ashay, for all the efforts that you've been putting in all the time, and we really look forward to it. So, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rekha. It's been an honor over the last 3 to 4 years working together, and we brought on such great speakers together and events together and learned a lot. So thank you, Rekha. Big shoes to fill, but we'll try my best.
No. I'm sure you're going to take things to a different height altogether, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you, Rekha. Thank you for the intro, and very, very warm welcome to Harsh. For everyone that's joined, today's topic is extremely interesting, and it's a topic called Long India. And in financial terms, long means something that you buy and hold and wait for it to mature, to reap future dividends and benefits. And so this topic, Harsh is a master on, especially given where we stand as a country. We've had a lot of events focused on the economy, certain startups, certain sectors, but this is the first time we're going to do an event focused structurally on India, the political structure, the institutional strength, the cultural factors, and of course, you cannot ignore economics. So we will be discussing a wide range of topics, and Harsh is extremely qualified to comment on this. Not only is he an investor, public markets investor, he also authored a book called A New Idea of India, which was unique because it was touted by both sides of the aisle of the political spectrum. It wasn't, a very partisan or dividing book. It was a factual-based analysis, and everyone from Shashi Tharoor of the Congress Party to the Prime Minister of the country has written reviews as well as tweeted about it. And it was a fascinating read for me, and I've been fortunate to get a signed copy by Harsh. He is also a public interest director at NSE Gift City, and regularly features in the leading publications of India, Hindustan Times, Mint, Swarajya, and many more. So Harsh, welcome for today's series. It's been long due. Excited to have you on board. Wanted to invite you to say a few words of welcome for our audience and everyone who's joined.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure and honor to be invited to this August platform. I have seen some of the personalities who you have interviewed earlier, and I hope I can do justice to this invitation.
Absolutely, I have no doubt that you will. We'll get started. Just a quick format check. I will interview Harsh for a good part of 40 to 45 minutes. By the time the chat room is open, so we will go into Q&A at around 7:45 p.m. So you can start putting your questions in the Q&A box. We will unmute you so you can directly talk to Harsh for questions at the end of the session. So, let's keep it going and engaging. So Harsh, we can get started. So we define the topic as Long India, focused on institutional, political, cultural, and economic strengths. So let's delve straight into the political and institutional side of things. So, let's define a few characteristics that happened and events that happened. With COVID and inflation, the RBI stepped in and our monetary policy was strong. Our political, with the war in Ukraine, our geopolitical spectrum and our geopolitics was relatively sound, if not a bit controversial. So what are your views on the foundational and institutional strengths of India? And how do you see our institution foundation as we approach India at 100? Like, you had that conversation with Shashi Tharoor and Rajiv Pardesai. So your comments on the institutional side.
Asha, before I answer this specific question, since it's the very first question, I'd just like to lay a very quick context. Sometimes what happens is we miss the very large picture. So in hard dollar terms, India's per capita income is $2,500. Slightly more maybe this year. For the US, it's approaching $80,000. So it's 30x or more. Right. Now, economists call this broad differentiation in economic performance over the last few centuries between West and East. They call it the Great Divergence. We don't have to go by technical terms. But what is happening more or less since the turn of the century is what some people have started calling the Great Convergence. Right. So India is one part of that larger story. And the way to think about it, and this is how we go into your question on institutions, is one of the reasons why those parts of the world which are now catching up, a huge part is state capacity or a functional state, competent state. Of course, it's on a spectrum. It's not 0 or 1. And in many ways, India has more and more of a functional state. The reason why that is important is because in the last few decades, we had somewhat of a partially misleading debate of state versus market, right? That was the whole socialism, communism debate. But that was actually a very contextual debate in the West, who already had developed states. In the 1980s, we had the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, and they said, okay, should we dial it up, should we dial it down? That thing blew up because obviously they also dominated intellectual discourse. You and I both are alumni of US universities. Yep. That thing blew up, and some people took it, including a younger version of me, to be very libertarian and almost mini-anarchist, even an anti-state. What we have to understand is there are some things which only a state, in the sense that organization and coordination can happen at a larger scale. You need that, and you need the apparatus for market competition on top of that. So it's not either or, they actually complement each other. So the thing to understand is not why some country is rich or some country is poor. In a few decades, we might be thinking, wait a second, why did those 200 years happen? They were a bit of an anomaly. Shouldn't all economies be roughly proportional to their populations? Which is what the case was actually for most of human history. You might have 20, 30, 40% above or below. So if that's the case, then obviously India and China are prima facie candidates for being the world's largest economies. So I'm just setting the tone because after all, India has 4.5 times the US population, but in hard dollar terms, 30x lower the per capita income, and in purchasing power adjusted 8 times maybe. So that being the case, now coming to your question, since state capacity is important, the first thing to understand about India's institutional, before going to COVID or RBI, is that we are a democracy. Yep. Democracy is the very foundation of the Indian state. Democracy is what keeps India united. The democratic state, India is the only country which is growing rich, which started off with universal adult franchise, and it was extremely poor, almost universal illiteracy. We had our first elections in 1951-52. 1947 was independence, 1950 was declaration of republic, and except for 1.5-2 years in the mid 70s, when democracy was suspended, we've always been a democracy. That is very unique. I mean, from Israel to South Korea, you don't find a large functioning democracy anywhere except India. So that is the basis. Now, of course, within that, we are increasingly modernizing institutions. So you mentioned the RBI, which is the Reserve Bank of India, or the central bank. For example, it got itself an inflation target in agreement with the executive and the legislature. Now, there are critics and blah, 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 there are all these details, but we are trying to make it as institutional and as less discretionary as possible. You mentioned pandemic time. For example, in the US, often you would not get online instant certificates for your vaccination. In India, we did. And we'll come to that, what is known as broadly as public digital goods or digital public goods. Right. Very important part of augmented state capacity in India. So the big picture is not why some country is rich or poor, why there is a difference. A large part of the reason is state capacity. And to India, the modern state by definition is new. I mean, remember, the US became the US in 1776. We became India in 1947. And therefore, I suspect in a few decades, we will be surprised. Why were we surprised that India became so rich so quickly? So that's my starting.
Yeah, and just a follow up to that, I think that's an important point you raise about the US and 1776, because I love history, and I'm sure, and I know you do as well. Like till even the 1920s, for example, women couldn't vote. That was
Yeah.
150 years afterwards. Till the 1920s, like the country became rich before it became a democracy. When we were in the Gilded Age of Rockefeller and Carnegie, there was no really rule of law. It was them who built the country first and then adopted democratic values. So having said that, do you think being a democracy is an advantage long term for India? Or, for example, you mentioned China. In 1985, we had converging growth lines. And then we went down and they shot up. And they've brought up about 400, 500 million people out of poverty. So would you think that democracy is a good option for a poor country? Or is it an option for a richer country after it's accumulated wealth?
I think it's difficult to give a very universal answer for the simple reason that democracy has certain prerequisites in terms of the mental makeup of the people. Need not necessarily be education in a formal sense.
Yep.
Indian civilization uniquely lent itself to a discussion, democratic-based governance model, where things can get heated, but they generally do not get violent beyond a point. Now, having said that, in India, I would paraphrase, or I would reshape your question by saying it's not an advantage. It is more like a must-have. India would not be India without democracy. We would not be united without democracy. You mentioned the example of China. China, as you know, they have local variations, but they have one Mandarin script, right? I mean, the Chinese state capacity has been residually strong for almost 2,000 years. Of course, the Mandarin might be different than Cantonese and so on and so forth.
But there's 95% speaking Mandarin. So
yes, so I mean, it's a relatively, I mean, sometimes people exaggerate Chinese homogeneity, but it's a relatively homogeneous population.
Right.
And what I mean by that is today, Xi Jinping being the dictator effectively of communist China, you as a Chinese person, Chinese citizen may like him or dislike him, but you're not going to like him or dislike him because he's from that part of China or he's from this caste or he's from that community. That thing does not come in. And what I mean by implication in the case of India is if there was an Indian dictator, that thing would enter India. Yep. So India is united because it's a democracy. Of course, it's a democracy for deeper civilizational reasons. You can discuss that. But it is united uniquely because it's a democracy. In fact, we are both sitting in Mumbai, and the Maratha resistance to both the Mughal and British rule in India eventually petered out despite great heroics because there was no internal way of transfer of power. And therefore, there were divides. That we can learn from history, and I think at the very top Indian leadership, as well as the average person on the ground, in their bones, they understand that this is a deeply Indian value, without which India would not exist. Forget it being an advantage or disadvantage. So that's how I would understand it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, historically, India has been kingdoms, right? Before the British came, before the Mughals came, it was different kingdoms, always warring against each other. Now we have united it under one central government, which is, that takes time, like how much Prime Minister Modi said.
In my book, A New Idea of India, which you, thank you for mentioning that at the beginning. So there's a line which is co-authored with my colleague Rajiv Mantri, who's a venture capitalist. We mentioned that India is a civilization that is turning into a nation through the instrumentality of a democratic state. So like a nation implies something slightly more coherent. A civilization has common sense. It is the biggest unit of humanity, short of all of humanity itself. It has a certain common sense, but it can be much more diffused. So India, as you mentioned rightly, had a lot of political decentralization, civilizational unity. But what we have now is, on top of that, a relatively coherent nation state, and therefore I call it a civilizational state or civilizational republic. And there are pros and cons of everything. There are all these kinds of homogenizing kind of tensions inherent, centrifugal versus centripetal. But broadly, it seems like we've held the right balance on unity and diversity. I think there is a book called The Narrow Corridor. I'm forgetting the name of the two academics who wrote the book. But you need the right balance between state and society to maintain a strong state but an open society. That's the narrow corridor, right? And India is, in that very unique sense, in that narrow corridor at a very, very large scale. So in many ways, it's just the right moment for the right civilization to step up.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And on the topic of us being on the right place and at the right foundation, I wanted to, like we discussed earlier, kind of like touch upon few parts of an institution. So institutional strength. First being we discussed the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, as a financial kind of institution. Then there's the judiciary, which today ease of doing business in India, in my opinion, is governed by the judiciary. We have 4 crore plus pending cases in the country, divided between the Supreme Court, High Court, and the local courts. We don't have enough judges. Contract enforcement is an issue for business as well as any other kind of engagement. So I wanted your long view on these institutions, individual institutions, if you can make comments on, say, the judiciary or the RBI, and then we'll go to the political spectrum.
So broadly, I mean, there are 3 concurrent institutions, right? Legislature, executive, judiciary. There's also a problem in the sense that the legislature and executive in India are too overlapping. That is because, I mean, that is inherent in, India has tried to be inspired by various democracies, British, American, others. But it's eventually slightly more modeled on the British system. And in the British system, legislature and executive are overlapping in the sense that the prime minister has to have the confidence of the parliament. However, in India, we also have something called the anti-defection law, which is in turn means that lack of internal democracy. Which in some ways it's good because you want stability in the treasury benches. Just look at the number of prime ministers in UK going and coming, right?
Correct.
You have a backstabbing kind of Brutus situation every now and then. On the other hand, even on issues, you have to vote with your party line. So that's one issue. I think it came in the 1980s because in Hindi they call it Ayaram, Gayaram. A lot of politicians were just being bought and sold. That's one aspect. I think eventually it will get sorted because as voters get more educated and demanding, they would want to be represented and have divergence even within one political party. On the judiciary, I think what happened is the judiciary in India became much more activist during the 1990s, which was the first era of coalition governments. So when the legislature and executive became weak, the judiciary basically stepped in. And once it stepped in, it's difficult for it to go back because it proclaims certain powers, certain doctrines. And we are seeing the incipient signs of tensions between legislature and judiciary. It's still on a manageable keel right now. It's not gotten as far as what we saw in Israel recently. But I think if the Modi government gets re-elected for a 3rd term, I think there'll be more pushback. That in turn leads to the number of judicial appointments, judge appointments, therefore the number of cases. You mentioned tens of millions of cases. And it's true, contract enforcement is a problem. It's a big problem. So is somewhat arbitrary kind of judicial activism. But I will take the long view that it's not just important for commerce, it's also important for societal reasons. You see, in a country with better contract enforcement, more individuals and communities can become entrepreneurs. Because historically, if I defaulted against you on a business contract, loan, whatever, we used social shaming as a way of getting it back. Right? That obviously works only within certain communities. And we want to democratize entrepreneurship beyond caste and community. So I think that it has very important, more broadly rule of law, law and order, more policing capacity. I think the trend is in the right direction. I think it is frustratingly slow sometimes. But I must say that which is one of the reasons why we have large conglomerates in India. Right? I mean, because larger conglomerates it's one central clearinghouse for all kinds of interface with the state, both legitimate and sometimes less legitimate. So, in the 1960s and 70s, we had these large American conglomerates, and then there were actually the Nifty 50 go-go days. Then they kind of died down. So I'm sure with better state competence on this particular axis as well, you will find more specialized vertical corporations as opposed to these conglomerates. But right now we are in that transition phase. I totally concede that point.
And interesting point you made about conglomerates, because when we had an event with Mahindra, Anisha, the MD and CEO of Mahindra, we asked about, why is Mahindra selling fertilizers, auto, tractors, as well as cars? And he said, before the 1990s, India used to be a license Raj state. So the bigger you are, the more chances for you to get into business and get the licenses. So you'd rather have, and there was a trust factor as well that happened at the same time. If, Tata can sell you salt and Tata can sell you a car as well. And Tata can...
It's a brand thing as well as the lack of state capacity to some extent. And it's fine so long as they deliver. But it's just one of those things where it is difficult it's easier compared to 5-10 years ago, partially because of private capital coming in. A lot of people who have no family business legacy doing startups. So, we don't want to oversell this, that the delta is very, very positive. But if you take a snapshot, the snapshot is very much what we are discussing.
Yep, absolutely. And now that we've been discussing state capacity, I want your comments on our political stability as a country. As a country that has general elections every 5 years, but we have a lot of state elections that happen, or should we lose your video?
I'm fine. Tell me here.
Okay. So we have a lot of, general elections every 5 years, but we have state elections that are recurring. And a lot of governance time also goes into electability and winning elections versus actually administration. There's a lot of discourse, not only every day over the news channels, and you're obviously a big part of it, regarding the political stability and to attract investment, to execute projects at a large scale, infrastructure at a large scale. So what is your view on India's political stability, especially given the lines of a foreign policy that's happened with the Russia-Ukraine war, as well as a domestic policy as infrastructure and everything plays in?
Okay, that's a big omnibus of a question. Let me break it down in the sense that, see, first of all, after the 90s coalition phase, and maybe some years after that, we have entered a phase of political stability, and it's not just with one party, aka the BJP at the center. Even the non-BJP parties that are winning in states generally win with clean mandates. So one way to interpret that is the Indian voter is becoming more coherent and cohesive. And what I mean by that is, earlier democracy, because India was still a quasi-agricultural, feudal is too strong a word, but almost feudal kind of setup, and people used to call Indian elections an aggregate of local factors, right?
Yep.
So there was no national sense beyond a point. I mean, 1977 was an exception, a wave election. We want democracy at least, right? And
Yep.
I often say 1977 was in many ways one of the turning points of India. We kind of forget between 47 and 1991, because 77 established democracy as something unimpeachable in India. So it's becoming clear that there are strong mandates by the voters, and the middle 10-15% often might vote for one party at the center, another party in the states. So there is a sense of that this guy is good for me in Delhi, this guy is good for me in the state capital. So that's number one. That in turn depends on deeper cultural and civilizational factors. What I mean by that is, at the all India level, things have become much more mobile, horizontally, vertically. People are geographically moving from one city to another, from villages to cities. There are more intercaste marriages. It's the general sense of being Indian is less abstract. It's more specific. It's more coherent. And to put it even more specifically, the general sense of being Hindu or being dharmic, who constitute almost 4/5 of Indians, which also was an umbrella identity earlier, is becoming more and more real, because a lot of the customs were based on your community and your village, etc. But as India urbanizes and intermixes, etc., that identity becomes stronger, which in turn has political consequences. And I think we're in the early stages. I think eventually we will not. Right now, India is being dominated by the BJP, the union level.
Yep.
That's partially because the opposition has not understood that something fundamentally has changed in India. They're trying to just bank on anti-incumbency in India. Once that penny falls, I think we'll see a much more competitive electoral democracy in India again, however, with the new consensus. So, and why is that important? You mentioned infrastructure, you mentioned foreign policy. So it is now much more difficult to kind of exploit India by playing on its fault lines.
Yep.
Don't get me wrong, people are still trying. They will be occasionally successful.
Right.
This is part of realpolitik, both internally and externally. But because India is more coherent in a self-aware manner, irrespective of what shape or external form a particular political party might take, we are basically seeing, for example, more outlays on infrastructure. It's a classic case of deferred gratification, right? What is infrastructure? Infrastructure is short-term pain long gain, right? So you are, as a voter, endorsing somebody actually making your road half for the next 3-4 years, your life more difficult for the next 3-4 years, because you understand conceptually that a metro or some kind of urban transport or a railroad or expressway will come, which will after 3-4 years make my and my family's life better and the overall economy, etc., better. So that sense is improving. That stability in turn gives India more heft on the global stage.
Correct.
Because obviously, if you have a weak prime minister or if you have a weak coalition government, it's easy for the other guy to push you beyond the point because he understands you may not be able to take it beyond the point. So I think India is very clear. It wants to be its own pole in the geopolitical world. I think you come to the foreign policy part of your question. At the same time, India is very friendly with democracies without being evangelist about democracy. So I think that's the difference. So for example, India is naturally more comfortable with democracies. I think its relationship with Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia is partially a relic of the Cold War, in the sense that the US could not woo India beyond a point, partially as a function of geography, because India did not want China and Soviet Union to be on the same Eurasian power stage and have distant Western friends, partially a function of colonialism and the legacy of the mental legacy that left. But now it's much more the people to people, the commercial ties, for example, are much deeper between India and the US than India and Russia, or even India and China. However, of course, we have a lot of weapons trade, and India will not change its foreign policy just based on pressure. But I think there is no doubt that, for example, Narendra Modi as Prime Minister has signed many interoperability agreements with the US military on behalf of the Indian military. Right? Foundational agreements, as they're called. So India is more and more friendly with Western democracies, but it's not in a camp. And therefore, for example, we are buying a lot of Russian crude right now. Some of it is being refined and sold back to Europe and America. Europe especially, which kind of makes it funny, because then they don't want to, I mean, we don't mind pocketing the margins. I'm just saying it just sounds silly because they're actually buying it from us in PKs. So India pushed back on this concept of, don't buy Russian oil, because Europe actually was still very decently buying a lot of Russian gas. So there was an idea that, if it's a war in Iraq or Bangladesh, it's somehow less of a humanitarian disaster. But it's an invasion of Ukraine, as terrible as it is. Let us be very clear. It is. I do not in any way condone the invasion. However, from an Indian national interest point of view, to expect us to jump over hoops and cut off our commercial relations or weapon relations, energy relations. And I think that has been appreciated now in Western capitals. They also understand crude being a fungible commodity. If India buys to a certain extent, to that extent, prices globally are a bit low. So I think on the whole, this was a coming out party of India on the geopolitical stage. What seemed like a disaster in February 2022, because after all, before that, the Indian vision was to somehow wean Russia away from China, and if not towards the West, at least have some kind of modus vivendi. And obviously, this invasion kind of totally ruptured that. But it seems like India has realized it has more latent power already than it had perhaps discussed internally and externally.
Yep, absolutely. And I think as we grow as an economy and a market as well, that gives us more heft on the global scale. And one point with Russia to be remembered is that we wouldn't have had, I'm not saying we wouldn't have had, but in 1998, they did not oppose us in the United Nations for our nuclear test in Pokhran.
There is a long history there. 1971, the Bangladesh War of Independence, which India helped out, and which Pakistanis basically had a genocide of Bengali Muslims and Hindus in East Pakistan, became Bangladesh. The US had actually sent a carrier group into the Bay of Bengal, and Russia, then Soviet Union, had sent a carrier group shadowing that. But I don't think it's so much about history, because Russia had its own reasons, Soviet Union had its own reasons to help us out. So it wasn't gratitude or it wasn't gratefulness. It was simply that America till very recently was not selling us many weapons of the highest technology. And then below that, they were very expensive, or they just didn't suit us. And so America is not used to friends in the sense they say publicly. They're used to people in their camp, which is why even France is actually a bit of a difficult partner for the US. From 1966 to 2007, or was it? France was officially not in NATO, or at least the highest military command. So India is just going to be much, much bigger than France. And I think the US-India relationship will be much more like the UK-US relationship in the second half of the 19th century, especially post-US Civil War.
Yeah.
Not post-US Civil War. So
Civil War, okay.
From the 1870s to the two world wars, right? I mean, it's
Okay.
a long period of gradual handover from UK to US. And I think it requires a lot of psychological upgrading in DC because they need to be honest with themselves. Are they opposing China because it is autocratic? Or are they opposing China because they want to be number one?
Yeah.
Because if they want to be number one, I think it's perfectly reasonable for any Indian, not particularly nationalist, to want India to be number one as the world's largest economy eventually. But there is no, the average Indian is as talented or as dumb as the average human being anywhere else.
Yeah.
So I think there will be a lot of mutual adjustments on the way. It's going to be an interesting journey.
Absolutely. And I think this is a perfect segue into the economic drivers part of our conversation. And just to remind our audience today, we'll be going to Q&A in around 15 to 20 minutes. So please, keep putting your questions and we'll get to you shortly. So Harsh, on the economic angle, you laid a perfect foundation. And I want to take that example, what you made of the, infrastructure as delayed gratification. Like, you're voting for someone to break down your road for 4 years. We live in Mumbai, Maharashtra. Our metro project was, stalled for 3 to 4 years when we had the coalition government. And, investors also look at that. And my argument was always when the whole Gautam Adani, Hindenburg thing came out, is you need at some point private investment to launch your public infrastructure, whether it is ports, whether it is roads, whether it is airports. And that's how the US was built. That's like your steel, railroads, oil was built by Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, right? And then the government kind of came in and managed. So we are on that similar course. So what are the biggest macro and microeconomic trends that are on your radar that you'd like to highlight as we look at this Long India at 2047, want to become the biggest economy of the world? What are some of the trends or foundational elements that you'd like to highlight as to why you are Long India?
So I think the biggest macro element on top of everything that we've discussed is scale. It's very, very important to understand why scale matters. So I always say, like, in physics, for example, at very micro levels, you have quantum physics, right? For normal ranges, you have what is known as Newtonian mechanics, right? At very high levels, very large scales, you have relativity, right? You have Einstein's theory of light being bent by very massive objects in space-time, that kind of beautiful graphs that I was a big physics wonk. Anyway, I dropped out of engineering to study economics. So it's very important to understand why scale matters. See, right now, one of the reasons the US keeps growing is because of scale, right? So what does scale mean? I mean, Adam Smith wrote about it. The extent of the market determines the division of labor, right? It's very simple. So if you have 1,000 people, you might have a few cobblers, etc. You will not probably have some very niche tattoo artists, right? Because for that, maybe you need 10,000 people relatively rich. If you have 100,000 people, you have people who are full-time podcasters. You're not a full-time one, you're a part-time one, but there are full-time, right? So the bigger the market, the more affluent the market, it becomes more of a virtuous cycle, because you have more people who can specialize in one particular area, therefore become more productive, in turn leading to more prosperity, and therefore demand some more niche services. So scale is very important. And the reason why scale is important to understand. The middle income trap is nothing but a lack of scale. A lot of people in economics, or what I mean by that is, let's think of, for example, brain drain, as is often said. In India, at $2,500 per capita income, already some of the smartest IITians are not leaving India.
Right.
The reason they're not leaving India, as opposed to a very smart engineer in Ghana or even a Latin American country, or even some Southeast Asian country, is because even though the per capita income is poor, just the multiplier factor, now that we have good telecommunication, relatively integrated market, GST, however imperfect, etc., you have the go-to market on a billion people. Like it might be 100 million for the kind of service you are selling.
Right. Right.
Eventually you have a story to sell to your investors and to yourself that this thing scales to XYZ or by a factor of magnitude in X number of years.
Yeah.
And therefore you can invest your life over and above emotional reasons, over and above patriotic reasons in this country, being the creme de la creme of global talent. You still choose to stay in India.
Yeah.
Right? And that in turn leads to more growth in India, and then the cycle continues, right? It's a snowball effect. I mean, the famous biography of Warren Buffett is called Snowball. So,
Yep.
so that is very important to understand. That has massive consequences for macro monetary policy.
Yep.
For example, so I wrote an article saying that by FY31, end of 2030, India will have around a $12 trillion economy. I mean, the most bullish estimates are around 8 trillion. I think Mukesh Ambani said 10 trillion. And part of the reason is the currency will start to appreciate. It's called Balassa-Samuelson. It's very technical. I don't want to go into the cycles of the dollar. Interest rates will fall, and general people will in the mid 2030s the rupee might become a hard currency, a reserve currency. For example, the Chinese, because of the political system and because the political system forces them to be geopolitically adverse to outsiders, because otherwise, if there is not the situation of war, the relatively prosperous Chinese will say, wait a second, why are we not voting for our leaders, right? So to keep that element of war, they have to almost structurally be antagonistic to the rest of the world. And therefore, they have to have a closed capital account. And therefore, the renminbi cannot be a global reserve currency beyond a point.
Right.
The European Union's euro, it's not the same, euro area and EU, not exactly the same, they're overlapping. Right now, there is a question mark whether they can become the United States of Europe, right? Will they remain coherent or not? Will Germany share its economic prowess, and will France share its nukes as well as UNSC permanent seat? UK has already left for the time being, right? So where is the other, if you take a 10, 15-year view, there is no other large economic unit coming on the horizon except India.
Yep.
ASEAN won't become one country. Mercosur in Latin America won't become one country. Nigeria recently allowed the African Union to trade. It's very, very low density, very large continent, in very early stages of that happening, if at all, right? So the only other player who can have the scale on the global system without having massive geopolitical enemies except communist China for the time being, has what is right now the language of commerce globally, English. The Indian, not just elite, but middle classes speak English. The de facto lingua franca of India is some kind of English Creole. Therefore, it's very plug and play system. You can already see that in our services exports last year. And it's going to continue. So therefore, the scale factor in India is extremely important to understand, which will lead to this massive snowball effect, which I don't think that is appreciated enough, because people often end up comparing India with Indonesia. Indonesia is a very large country, 250 odd million people.
Right.
It's not 1400 million people.
It's Uttar Pradesh.
Right. It's basically Uttar Pradesh, India's most populated state. So I think that part is very important to understand how entrepreneurship will go onto that virtual side. On the micro side, we can discuss the various state capacity factors we discussed, right? In terms of reforms, we've had there was something called the American system. Abraham Lincoln was a voter for it. Alexander Hamilton originally. There was a German-American economist called Frederick List. I often tell people, read Frederick Hayek, but also read Frederick List. Reality is somewhere in the middle. So what the idea was, have first an integrated market. Again, exploit your own scale. Throughout the 19th century, the weighted average import tariff on American manufacturing goods imports were 40%. We are not going back to that. It's just be aware, how can you exploit your scale without being close to the global economy? Again, not autarky, not license Raj, but not as if you're Singapore, right? There is something you can exploit here. So that there is an element of first integrating a domestic market, which you did with the GST, build infrastructure, which I think in Adam Smith's time we used to call internal improvements. I find it to be much more like charming and quaint, calling it internal improvements. We're doing that, right? Again, we're doing that on a massive scale that helps manufacturing in turn. We are doing a bit of an industrial trade policy. The US NSA, Blinken? No, Blinken is the Secretary of State. The US National Security Advisor, I'm forgetting his name, just gave a speech at Brookings saying that we basically have to go back to industrial policy, guys. because of China. And actually, Narendra Modi did that earlier in 2017-18. I wrote an article, I gave a speech somewhere saying Modinomics is actually building on that Alexander Hamilton idea. It's actually played out and further accelerated because of COVID and then the Russia-Ukraine war, geopolitics. So there is an element of building an integrated market because of reforms and infrastructure, building up on human capital, not just in terms of education, that's very important, but also health, sanitation, water access, electricity access, which all of these things which are kind of forgotten in India. But Narendra Modi has made, of course, a lot happened before. I don't want to sound partisan, but I'm saying he accelerated and doubled down on these things. Imagine a woman in an Indian village who need not travel 2 hours a day for drinking water.
Correct.
Or she needs to travel half an hour to go relieve herself. This is safety, the convenience, and the kind of time she can spend on earning money or taking care of her family. Same for men, etc. These small micro improvements, we just have near universal literacy amongst the younger generation, now near universal electricity access, almost near tap water portable access, which will get completed in 2-3 years, almost near universal Pakka roads. Pakka roads means roads that don't get destroyed in English. These small things, and of course, now we have the world's cheapest data, some of the most downloaded data, good, bad, ugly, everything. And people suddenly have gone from their economic unit de facto being the village.
Correct.
In 10-15 years, not just this government primarily, but earlier government as well as the private sector. Geo Reliance obviously is a private sector contribution. In 10-15 years, we've gone from the village being the basic economic unit of that person's life. It was not completely cut off, but almost cut off, to the world being the economic unit.
Right.
And in that sense, I don't disagree. I don't agree with the deglobalization narrative. It's just going to become more services than goods, more regionalization, more friend-shoring, more near-shoring. Trade is not stopping. Indian trade to GDP is almost 50%. It's actually higher than China. China obviously has a larger GDP, higher than US and Japan as well. Right. So India has gone from 10th largest economy when Narendra Modi became prime minister to 5th right now. In my calculations, in 2 years, it'll be the 3rd. It's already the 3rd in purchasing power parity.
By PPP,
by PPP, by adjusting for cost of living differences. So so having good reforms, good infrastructure, good industrial trade policy, while broadly following free markets, investing in human capital for which you need to do more, and having good financial markets for intermediation of capital, which also we did a massive cleanup the last few years, right? We have a IBC, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. India has a surprisingly dynamic equity market for its level of development. The bond market less so, but the bond market honestly is liquid only in the US. We are getting there as well. So we are in the early stages. For example, India has the largest REITs and InvITs in Asia, the real estate investment trust, the listed kind of quasi mutual funds. So that it's really creating this bouquet of a lot of Indians are doing SIP, systematic investment, small amounts being put in their monthly mutual funds. Not exactly analogous to a US 401k because tax benefits might be different, but something like that. And therefore, everybody is increasingly invested in the India story. Everybody wants to belong in India in that sense. And everybody is directly or indirectly paying taxes. If they're not part of the direct tax net, that is relatively small. Because of GST, almost everybody is indirectly paying taxes. So everybody in that sense has a direct stake in the India story, economically and otherwise, much more than they did 10 years ago. And I think these are the large macro and micro factors I would really, right now India is about 3.5% of the global GDP. We have around 18% of the world's population. Even if you don't outperform, you just average perform. You have a 6x in percentage terms over and above whatever the global growth is, right? So there is, in that sense, massive tailwinds. Don't get me wrong. Some of the tailwinds is simply because of the low starting point. It's just a low base effect.
Of course,
But when you are in that up kind of wave, we are not complaining. So that's where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think before we go into the Q&A, we have the cultural factors to go in, which I'll ask as we go into the Q&A. I wanted to pinpoint your point on public market participation by, you said SIP. I mean, as just pure stats, it's around 6% of India participates in the public markets or in equities, for example. Now, what is needed to, so you talked about the snowball effect. What is needed to enhance trust in these markets, institutions, that, more of the public plays in the market and that rotates currency more in the system? And how do we increase also private investment in the country? Because a lot of investment is public investment. How do we bolster that?
I think, broadly we are doing the right things. There's some things I disagree with the current government on. I think they are they're trying to, in some cases, not kill, but tax the golden goose a bit too early. I think they are also slightly too paranoid, I think, on the capital account liberalization side. If at all, we've actually done some regressive things recently. For example, you have something called a TCS, tax collected at the money being sent outside. And I mean, it's done with good intentions, don't get me wrong, but it betrays a small economy mindset. And I think I only half jokingly say, therefore I'm half serious, that it's a generational issue. I have to understand. I think Harsha Bhogle made a very interesting comment in some interview that we grew up thinking what could go wrong. And this next generation, I think he's talking about the IPL, they grew up thinking what can go right. And I think to some extent it's a generational issue. Of course, there are many exceptions. I don't want to be ageist, but to some extent, I think some wit said science advances one funeral at a time. We can moderate it by saying one generation at a time. So I think there is an element of, for example, how to deepen the capital markets. The dividend tax dramatically increased. You actually want the dividend taxation to be slightly lower than capital gains tax, if anything.
Correct.
So that volatility is less, and the so-called grandmas and grandpops, the widows and widowers can also invest. It becomes more of a quasi debt instrument, not just a full-fledged volatile equity instrument. I think that's one angle of it. I think more broadly, for example, India was talking of entering global bond indices. The only country, definitely the only major country, which is not in these global sovereign bond indices. And India would immediately have a 5-10% weightage. And that's sticky capital, because all these fund managers have that as an index, as a benchmark, and they do their alpha plus minus, but basically you have to have that broad weightage. We've been discussing and there are valid points. I'm not saying it's as simple as the way I'm putting it, but we've refused to enter partially because we don't understand the bigger picture. The only true way to have monetary autonomy in a world dominated by the Fed is not to hide, is to become your own pole. Because even when you hide, you're still quasi following the Fed. I mean, this time the RBI paused just before the Fed. I think this 25 basis point was probably the last hike this cycle of the Fed. We declared the pause last time, just a month earlier. But that was about it. Broadly, we follow the Fed. You have to, right? Because that's 40% of the global market cap. We are 3-4%. It's just math. So I think we have to understand that we can be an independent pole. It's not just about saying that. It's about believing that. It comes with scale. It happens slowly with confidence. And I think now that the boom that we'll see, because we are cyclically at a strong peak dollar phase right now, we are very much like 2003 in that sense. 2023 is very much 2003. I think the next few years, we'll see a lot of foreign money flowing in. In fact, you'll hear a lot of talk, I'm predicting right now, about hot capital, Tobin taxes, et cetera. But I think this time we'll finally pivot to a more open capital account. And I think that will lead to a lot of money from outside India to inside India. Within India, it's more about awarenesses. The mutual fund industry has been running great campaigns. Mutual fund sahi hai, which translates mutual fund is correct. I think we are just in the early phases. I think there is broadly the mutual fund industry, the Indian finance industry has done a great job. It's very easy to buy mutual funds like sachets on a monthly basis. It's all automated. It gets deducted from your account. You can do it via an app. We have something called eKYC, electronic know your customer, so you don't need to fill those long forms anymore. It really, I mean, the building blocks are all in the place already. But on the margin, I think we just need to be less paranoid about the capital account and the taxation side. Although broadly, I must say, on the taxation side, the government has done a good job on the indirect taxes. They cut the corporate taxes. I think on the individual side, we have to understand we need to be eventually a magnet, not just for Indian talent, but regional and eventually global talent. Right? I mean, there is, for example, there is no equivalent of an Indian PR. If you're an American, you may not want to naturalize as an Indian citizen, but maybe you want to jump jobs. You are just more adventurous. You want to try this emerging market who you're convinced listening to Asha and Harsh is the next big thing. and you want to start your career, run an enterprise, and there are already some people doing that in Gurgaon, Bangalore, etc.
Yeah.
Can they have something like a PR? Do they have to marry an Indian to get a PR? Why not? Why? Eventually, we need to be confident enough to have dual citizenship. That's another very touchy issue. But I think, so long as those dual citizens are not allowed to be elected politicians or be in sensitive jobs, and we have the broad control on the process, actual dual citizenship, not OCI, will actually give a lot of diaspora much more emotional stake back into the mother country. So these are the small things. I'm sure it'll happen with time. Eventually, one of the things you learn is that just because you are at that age of your life doesn't mean that the rest of the world will go at that pace. But except these few caveats, I think broadly we're doing the right things.
Yeah, I think that's a great context into foundations, both micro and macro. So Harsh, we have some few questions, so let's get into that. And obviously, we didn't get to the cultural drivers. I'll add that as we go in. And for everyone, Harsh has very graciously agreed to stay extra for some extra time post 8 o'clock, depending on the questions and discussion. So let's keep it going. So first question is from Ramesh Subramaniam. I'm going to unmute Ramesh for his question. So Ramesh, would you like to ask Harsh a question?
Yeah, Harsh, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. And it's always good to hear the positive. But I'm wondering if you're leaving things like climate change in the long term, which could potentially devastate parts of the economy, make parts of the country unlivable, and so on. And if science is to be believed, it will particularly impact tropical countries like India. That's on the long term. And on the shorter term, it's, the perceived weakness and imbalance against countries like China. And we saw what happened at Galwan, right? So the guns versus butter should not derail us very quickly.
I think, Ramesh, is it?
Yes.
Both excellent questions. I'll take the questions in the order in which you asked them. I think first, science is not to be believed. I mean, I understand colloquially we say that. I think science is to be investigated, falsified in the Karl Popper sense. I'm not in any way a climate change denier. I think one of the best things the government is doing is having very aggressive environmental policy goals in terms of renewable energy, because there is a climate angle, but there is also an energy independence angle. There's a strategic angle. We are, after all, importing around 5 million barrels a day of crude, which obviously has a direct impact on our economy. However, in terms of the actual impact of anthropogenic global warming on lived experience, I am not that bearish. I mean, Netherlands has shown us how to live with large parts of the country under sea level. You build dikes. It's just another infrastructure project. We are doing more and more desalination. This is not to confuse that larger global trend with local urban pollution, for example, which is a real issue in India, famously in Delhi and the northern plains. But even this winter, Asha will agree, even in Mumbai, when there's too much construction, the smog, the smoke and the fog get together, etc., etc. There are real problems. There are real solutions. There are lapses in implementation of sensible regulation. But no, just climate change in the sense of anthropogenic global warming leading to disaster in India, I don't believe that. In fact, I'm pretty sure it won't even lead to disaster in Bangladesh. But so I just don't agree with large parts of Indian going underwater. Now, on the point of China, you mentioned the guns versus butter. That's an excellent point. You see, in economics, there's something called stated preferences and revealed preferences. See what is like Hindi mein we say, "Hathi ke daat dikhane ke kuch aur hote, khane ke kuch aur hote." Right? Elephant eat with different teeth. They have tusks for sure. I don't know why, to scare other animals or for mating reasons. So we say a lot of things, but the reality is we have a relatively popular government, and which has relatively hawkish government, which has not really increased the defense to GDP ratio. Defense expenditure as a percentage of GDP is around 2. I mean, depends whether you count pensions or this and that. In fact, they've increased some pensions. One rank, one pension was done by the government. We've tried to make the expenditure more efficient. We try to indigenize defense production. Some more of the capex, more of the value add is to be captured within the Indian economy. We liberalize the space sector. We're doing very good stuff on cyber and drones, etc. But it does not seem, therefore, that the Chinese can force us into a guns versus butter trade-off beyond a point. I mean, just empirically, it does not seem so, with all the political economic context of it. See, the Chinese understand very well that if they want to try to scare India into submission, this is their window. right? I mean, this is probably when the nominal GDP multiplier has peaked. Growth divergences will increase India from a lower base, et cetera, and they also are very aware that if they want to take Taiwan forcibly, India is in their backyard. It has a quasi alliance with the US. It's not a formal alliance. And I think it's honestly desperation on their part. I mean, as I said, the Chinese have to be in an antagonistic stage because of their political system. They had a very unique experiment for 20, 30 years where they had this something called collective leadership. So one dictator would be a dictator for 10 years, and then he would hand it over to the next dictator. And lo and behold, human nature being human nature, one dictator said, wait a second, I'm not going to hand over. And the reason I'm not going to hand over Xi Jinping, and therefore I'm going to get a third term, is because there are these massive threats to my country. So it's structurally inbuilt into the system to actually be antagonistic. So I think the Chinese situation can be handled. I'm not saying it's sanguine. I think the climate change situation can also be handled without confusing it with urban pollution and without confusing it with the extremely important need and urgency of renewable energy, solar, wind storage, as well as nuclear.
Great. Thank you, Ramesh, for that interesting question. And Harsh, your point about preferences are not stated, but actually in practice, it reminds me of a famous quote of Mark Zuckerberg, where he said that people want things and they want to want things. So it's very important to understand the difference there. Another new question came to me by direct message, I think by mistake, by Guru Shankar ji. I'm going to unmute him. Guru Shankar, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, thanks Harsh for the nice talk. I'm by qualification, I'm a chartered accountant into business. So one of the challenges which as an entrepreneur, which I find currently is the focus on lack of development finance or project finance per se. I mean, the government keeps talking, but in reality, nothing happens. Given your expertise on macroeconomic sphere, so do you see any change happening in the near future? Because this will directly impact quite a few critical issues for the country, like food security, employment. Because I'm talking about not like small farmers. I'm talking about an organized segment like plantation business, where it has got impact on food security, employment, and to a larger extent, the climate change too. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I'll broaden it more broadly to financial intermediation. Do we have loans for projects, etc.? I think it's absolutely true. One of the reasons I think when eventually India does transition more on open capital account, what's happening right now is the biggest conglomerates can raise money in dollar terms outside India relatively, I mean, until last year happened, but even with last year, at relatively low interest rates in a foreign currency, which they may partially hedge, for example, not fully hedge. And what has happened, if you look at in the Chinese model, it actually depends a lot on very state directed, but relatively low interest rates for these kind of project finances you mentioned, although it goes along with a certain amount of financial repression, right? So India being a democracy, we actually have higher small savings rate, postal office rates in real terms. This is one of the areas where democracy premium is less so and more for democracy tax. In India, somehow we feel that a risk adjusted, inflation adjusted real positive return is my birthright. That's actually not true anywhere else in the world. And the moment you talk about cutting interest rates, you're like, wait a second, there is this retired gentleman I know who's living in this South Mumbai cushy, leafy neighborhood. Of course, most people who are retired don't even get a pension. But anyway, I'm getting that. So what I think what will happen is a lot of the banks in India became very focused on retail in the last few years. Home loans, credit card loans, education loans, car loans. But a lot of them actually began as development banks, ICICI, even HDFC, etc. And so we are in this unique transition phase where absolutely you're right, the corporate or the industrial or the infra kind of lending, because of the NPA cycle, etc., is on a low phase. The bond markets haven't really taken off yet. the extra foreign capital hasn't come yet. And the new instruments of InvITs and REITs, while very useful, are still in the incipient phase. So it is a real issue. It is one of the reasons why larger corporates are finding it easier to enter new and new areas. So it's not just the contract enforcement Asha and I discussed. It's not just the branding effect, but it's also very much a financing angle.
Yep.
And I think it's a real problem for relatively medium-sized businesses right now. I do think India will transition to a lower interest rate regime almost per force in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that will reduce the asymmetries a bit. But I don't think there is a very immediate answer to this, I think, a very, very important question.
Thank you, Harsh. Yeah, I mean, basically we are losing a generation. We lose out on this opportunity. This is a high impact on the economy in terms of GDP or per capita, because I'm talking about.
I would disagree. I'm not sure we are losing a generation. I think what is happening is we are actually kind of definitely not doing as well as we could. I agree with that. But I think a lot of people arguably can have much more finance available for entrepreneurship than they had even 5 years ago. I mean, bank or project loan financing is not the only way. I mean, after all, there is venture capital, there is venture debt. I mean, people who had no business history are starting companies, right, left, and center. Of course, last year was tough. The 2-3 years before that was very good for raising capital. So I'll disagree on the summary, but once again, endorse your specific point that there is an asymmetry for smaller and medium companies in project kind of finance. That is a problem.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Guru Shankarji. Next question, Harsh. I had a comment on that, but we have questions coming in. It's from Mahesh Dumre. Mahesh, I'm going to unmute you for your question. He's an LB London Business School alum and also alum of Hong Kong University, I believe. So Mahesh, please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question. Mahesh, you're unmuted. You can go ahead, ask your question.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Yes. Hello.
Okay. So see, my question was, while we all understand this India potential, but we are quite used to shoot ourselves in the foot, right? That has happened many times in the past. We also command a very high premium as far as valuation in the markets goes. And the political situation, political fortunes change quite frequently. So what's the surety of that achieving India's true potential, right? What gives you confidence that we will be able to realize our potential?
So I think there's a difference between surety and confidence. I mean, if there was surety, then there would be no equity risk premium in the world. Nobody would buy debt, everybody would buy equities. Now, on the point of confidence, first of all, India's multiple valuation you mentioned is actually lower than S&P 500s right now. It is higher than most emerging market economies, that is correct. But I think the forward, I think the Nifty is at 18,000 something today. And I think this financial year, the earnings is going to be 1,000 for the Nifty 50. So that's about a forward earning of around, it's roughly the same or slightly lower than S&P 500. China was very low during the COVID lockdown. It's bounced back a bit tactically. And India always has traded a bit to the emerging market set as general, right? I mean, they also includes countries which are not really emerging, like South Korea, etc. You see, India has actually done very well. So when we say about shooting ourselves in the foot, it's not true. Actually, since the late 70s to now, on a per capita GDP growth rate basis, it has increased by 1 percentage point every decade. So if you go from, say, 1979 to 2019, I'm just taking the COVID as a cutoff, it has gone up by 1 percentage point every decade on a per capita real GDP growth rate. It's one of the smoothest curves you see for countries. It's just that the Chinese grew even faster. And therefore, in popular discourse, we seem to be overshadowed. And actually, the dependency ratio, we did not talk about demographics, of course, it's only an hour. The demographics in terms of dependency ratio peaked in both China and India in the 1970s. It bottomed out for China in 2015, so roughly 40 years. It bottoms out for us for at least another 20 years. So India had a more gradual improvement in dependency ratio than the Chinese did. And the Chinese, it's already reversed. And I'm not saying there is a 1-to-1 correlation, but there is a correlation with that and growth. So in many ways, the demographic transition is very much a growth input variable, at least. And in that sense, India has actually done very remarkably well. It's just that in the coming years, the GDP growth rate will actually add on to currency appreciation as opposed to currency depreciation we are used to the last 10, 20 years. So that's another topic, technical topic for itself. So we've actually not shot ourselves in the foot compared to the starting points. You have to remember that till recently in Uttar Pradesh, politicians were encouraging students to cheat in the name of caste and community. This is like, how dare you stop my community people from cheating and becoming matriculates and graduates because we need the dowry for their marriage, etc. Right? Whatever. So this the starting point is something we have to be aware about, right? It's only recently that we've hit near universal literacy and not just quality of education. That's so. I think we have not shot ourselves in the foot on a realistic relative basis. The evaluation is actually not expensive. We are basically giving America and India, one at $80,000 per capita income, one at $2,500 per capita income, the same damn valuation for the next 20, 30 years. To me, that's the biggest opportunity in the world. And I think these are the 2 points you mentioned, right? So the confidence, especially what gives me confidence in the now and here, is along with that, a lot of events seem to have turbocharged the bull thesis. See, one thing, for example, is COVID was a tragedy for a lot of our families in public health terms. But people said suddenly, you know what, I don't want to be in SF. Can I outsource some work to Austin? It's cheaper. And then somebody realized, well, if I can send to Austin, I can send it to Bangalore.
Yeah.
And so we had the next phase of kind of outsourcing, the third round, so to speak. We are seeing this mushrooming of global capability centers in Bengaluru, Pune, Hyderabad. Some people call it R&D centers, some people call it global in-house centers. And that is showing in non-software business service exports boom in the last year. I mean, in rupee terms, 35% more, in dollar terms, 25% or more. So it makes a lot of sense when there's such a massive divergence. India has a relatively large, underemployed, college-educated population, even if the quality is not that excellent one-to-one. So I think there are a lot of factors which are now suddenly technologically more doable. So this technology factor is on the services side. The China plus one factor is on the manufacturing side. On top of that, we have a government which, I think if you go to my Twitter handle, the tag tweet is on railroad capex of India as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah.
And despite the go-go years of 2003 to 2007, UPA 1, we did not really increase it beyond 1% much. It's like, it's 0.5%, something like that. It's around almost 2% right now. Classic case of investing in the future. So this is not just, I understand the skepticism, even the cynicism that, oh, we've been hearing, there's a famous joke, Brazil is always the country of the future, right? A lot of people joke about that about India as well.
Yeah.
But I think so. It's not, I mean, people also say that, you know, pessimists sound smart, optimists make money. And my point is, don't be pessimist or optimist, just be realist and just follow the empirical data.
Yep. Thanks, Mahesh, for your question, and thanks, Harsh. I think another famous quote for India is also, India disappoints both the pessimist and the optimist. So I think being a realist is the best way ahead. And Harsh, you touched on like an important point. The question prior to this on Guru Shankar around, you know, finance availability. When can we see institutions like the LIC put in money into the Indian markets or startups? 80% of our startups are funded by foreign funds, not necessarily a bad thing, but also results in our startups domiciling in Singapore and US. Data sovereignty, colonization, all that sort of stuff is a downstream effect. But when can we see, like, you know, LIC investing in?
Insurers are already putting money in the Indian public equity markets. What is not happening at a large scale is they're not seeding Indian hedge funds or private equity or venture capital funds.
Yeah.
The way you would imagine a Blackstone would have started 30, 40 years ago by going to various pension funds, insurance funds, even university endowment funds. That ecosystem is right now missing in India, with the caveat that it's changing, in the sense the EPFO was not investing in equities at all. I'm talking about public markets again.
Yeah. I
think it went from 0 to 5 to 10. I think it's at 15 right now. It's about to get to 15 right now. So that is the early stages. See, the Indian onshore fund structure is one of the things which has gotten hit by taxes. The AIF, what is known as Alternative Investment Fund, Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, roughly corresponding to VC, PE, and hedge funds. So if you do a long short hedge fund in India, for example, you raise money domestically through institutions, the top tax is now at 39%. The last year was 43%.
43, yeah.
So you can't really do a long shot with the tax rate of 39% even. I mean, it's better than 43. So there are some issues, but I think on the margin, there is more and more domestic capital coming in on the institutional side. It's happening first through public markets. They're putting more money in relatively low cost, low fees mutual funds and ETFs, so that they're not, people don't complain about cronyism, etc. It's just easier in India, right, to do things in that sense. For example, in the Adani case, there was a lot of scrutiny of LIC. So they don't want to do that. But I agree with you that eventually we need a deeper locally funded ecosystem. But it will start with public markets first, then only go into alternates.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's good context to set, because that we see a lot of globally your sovereign wealth funds, or even your UK government is using pension funds to put into private markets as well, and they're facing an issue. But when can we start bolstering that? Is good context for that. So Harsh, I mean, there's a lot of people still staying on, and I wanted to kind of touch on the cultural angles, if you don't mind, for a few minutes. You mentioned demographics. You mentioned India as a civilization to nation. I think we are at that inflection point where our identity, our culture, and demographic are on. It's a stage where we have to make a choice, or we've already made a choice as to what are we? Are we a civilization turning nation? Are we a nation after 1947? So what is your view on the new version of Bharat or India, and how are we set up for the next till 2047 as a civilization republic?
You see, I think the constitution begins with the words India, that is Bharat, which is the name of the first chapter of my book co-authored with Rajiv called A New Idea of India. It's being relaunched by Penguin on end of this month.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm also close to finishing a book called Long India about this today. So, no, of course, we existed before 1947. I mean, of course, we existed in a self-aware manner, as is discussed. We did not often have political unity, but the civilizational awareness. And this is interestingly, a lot of people who now call themselves Gandhians, Nehruvians, Ambedkarites, talk about this idea of India being basically born in 1947. Whereas the actual Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar were very clear that's not the case. They were all deeply engaged in this idea of what is India, right? So very deeply engaged with what represents India. The kind of Hindu modernity project, which started off in Bengal and then quickly spread to South India, Maharashtra, Punjab, etc. Because that's where it was first colonized by Europeans, and therefore there was a need for a interface. It's very clear that they're all going back either to the Vedas or to the sources of Hindu scriptures or unity, while agreeing or disagreeing and accepting or rejecting various parts. So unlike other religions, there is not an element of being literalist, but there is also not an element of not engaging with it all and starting ab initio. That's not the case. So we are very much a civilization in that sense. I think what is happening is, as I mentioned, because there is much more social, horizontal, economic, vertical mobility within India, the larger identity is becoming, we always have multiple identities. There's never one identity. You have, and even a caste or community identity can be relatively benign. It's not something you reject in toto. It's about whether it loses its relatively negative salient aspects or not. And that is what's happening in India right now. It's not completed. Rural India is somewhat different than urban India. Within urban India, there are different enclaves. So what's happening is a small example, like Ganesh Chaturthi is celebrated very loudly in Calcutta now, right?
Yeah.
It was a Bombay thing. Durga Puja is celebrated loudly in Delhi, in Bombay actually also. I went, right?
Big in Bombay.
It's not just it's not just internal diaspora migrants. It's also that there is a larger sense of diffusion of symbols and idiom and rituals, which is happening. So I think that is leading to a much more coherent sense without losing the diversity. And I think that's very important, because at the end of the day, if there is a fine balance between centripetal and centrifugal forces, right? So without that central voice, it becomes difficult to operate on the name of the nation and the name of the country. And that is when you have relatively more corrupt governments, you have governments which are more short-termist in nature, who do not want to take long-term moonshots, do not want to invest in infrastructure, etc. They may seem like different things, like economics and society, but they're actually deeply interconnected. And I think there's a broader trend we must understand, which is that the world itself is becoming more spiritual, not religious. Right? It's a term that is often mocked, but there is a deep. If you often on Facebook, your American friends will also have the spiritual but not religious. There is secular humanism, right? There is a certain element of neo-paganism coming back in the West. It's difficult for educated people to believe in literalist religions. Right? It's difficult for them to believe literally that the world started 6,000 years ago and there's nothing called evolution. And I think what's happening in that case, because man still remains a deeply spiritual animal, right? He or she wants to know, where did I come from? What happened to the universe? What is the meaning of it all? So that it does not, somebody who might go from an atheist phase does not stop thinking about these larger issues. And I think in that sense, the Indic traditions, the dharmic traditions are very uniquely poised to spread globally, whether they take that name or that shape or form or not is separate, right? So I think in that sense, modernity is very much in consonance with dharma. In a way, it is not in with literalist religions, which is why foreigners are surprised. Wait a second, why is a woman in a sari with a lot of Ganesh idols behind her back, murtis, the head of ISRO or this or that division, and taking part in this rocket launch? Because in that mindset, the science and religion are supposed to be orthogonal, opposed to each other. Whereas in the Indian lived experience, it's a much more nuanced take. And I think, so without being, I mean, there are negative aspects of our society, which also are related to religion. And in fact, there are 2 centuries of Hindu reform that have happened. We are very much standing on top of that. But we are in a position where we can actually think of dharmic universalism, right? And India being the kind of, not to use communist language, but the vanguard state of it. So I think it's eventually with Indian prosperity, there will be a sense of what does that mean. It's like the dog that got now what, right? I mean, prosperity is one aspect, self-actualization, the Maslow pyramid is another thing. So I think these are questions that are not going away, but there is very little understanding of that outside of India. There is a very kind of black and white, Hindu nationalist is equal to is equal to Adolf Hitler. I mean, it sometimes really, I mean, it's obviously offensive, don't get me wrong, but it's sometimes really funny as well. So I think, right now, nobody wants to understand or learn anything from people who are frankly poor, by and large, right? I mean, they will not say that to your face in those direct words. So you become more of an intriguing example to people as you grow richer. So I think this discussion will actually become stronger in the coming decades.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting comment you made on being poor and religious. I saw a graph of countries where religion and GDP, or per capita income, like most religious society was on the lower part of GDP. There was only one striking example, which was the United States of America, which was highly religious, which is more like middle America religious, but high per capita income.
Even that data item is slightly lagging. If you now look at the last 10 years, it's a massive de-Christianization in the US.
De-religionization. Okay.
De-Christianization specifically.
Okay.
The number of I don't know, atheist, agnostic, don't identify with any organized religion is just massively boomed in the US in the last 10 years, especially with the so-called millennials, a later generation.
Sure.
In fact, in some ways, the woke politics is actually a quasi-religion.
It is a religion.
It gives you the transcendence, right? Because it gives you the larger sense of meaning.
It's a belonging.
It still has some of those Abrahamic features, right? There has to be sin, there has to be redemption, there has to be us versus them. So it's not leavened out by kind of dharmic thought yet, but it is actually early stages of. So I'm not particularly worried about woke politics because I see it as the early stage of de-Christianization. And I also see it actually as something which India has already done. India has done affirmative action 70 years ago.
Yeah,
so
of course.
They went from John Rawls, which was kind of a classical liberal, identity neutral, behind the veil kind of thought experiment liberalism, to if you're white, you're white. If you're black liberalism, right? And once that became stale, they went to this extent of saying, like children should be allowed to change their sex.
Yeah.
To operations, I mean, and which is why they have now started canceling people who wrote Harry Potter, or forgetting the name of the author.
J.K. Rowling. Yeah.
They started canceling, very moderate liberal people like J.K. Rowling, because she fully agrees with LGB and partially has some questions on T, right?
Correct.
She's not dissing anybody. She just has questions.
Question.
That, I don't want a biological male to enter a female toilet, no matter what he or she identifies as. So it has become a bit of a cult in some aspects, but I broadly see even woke politics in America in that larger sense, ironically, as a positive development.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a different perspective, because I kind of, if you see my Twitter, I'm always like retweeting and all, like against the woke politics.
I think we are all performers on this social media stage, so it's fine.
Yeah, and so I mean, last question before we kind of close is: will India ever see UCC? Can we be at India at 100 at 2047? Can we be a nation that has different laws for different groups? And I think you're obviously, your new idea of India touched on it, that you want individual rights in a civilizational state. Will we see UCC? How does that play out implementation wise?
We will definitely see UCC. UCC is in many ways downstream, Uniform Civil Code, or religion neutral personal civil laws, common civil code, however you want to frame it. The reason why that will happen is downstream of the last point, right? So in many ways, the Westphalian state order was a result of Christian civil wars in Europe, right? And then nation became the foci of your identity gradually, right? The French Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. The French, for example, famously did not fully support the Catholics in the European wars of religion, because they were a state. They actually partially supported some of the Protestant princes, etc. It's too technical. The point is, a state eventually provides education, health, etc., and you let go of that need of that medieval form of religion.
Right.
It's very interesting what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now, right?
Yeah, MBS. Yeah.
Famously known as MBS, and to some extent UAE's MBZ, who just became the most powerful person there as well, not just de facto but de jure. They're actually going to a certain form of nationalism, right? I mean, I think even something as silly as Arabic or Islamic coffee is now being called Saudi coffee. They're starting, it's no longer the pact between the House of Saud and the Wahhabi founder, but just the time when they won some wars in the 17th century or 18th century. And women are being allowed to drive, to study, to intermix. There are apparently music concerts happening in Saudi Arabia, not UAE, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and IPL is full of Visit Saudi ads. Yeah. Like they commercialize it.
And this is this, of course, they're going towards literalist Islam. Partially happened as a response to the Iranian Revolution, Islamic Revolution, 1979. Before that, I think somebody had just entered Mecca. Some Muslim extremists, they had actually called the French army and others to help clean it without accepting it. So long story short, there is a sense of religion having been tried out and it having not worked. So it's very early days, don't get me wrong. As a policymaker, you don't want to get your guard down. But there is a sense of, if just like eventually Europe was known as Christendom, it was the cultural heart of Christianity, despite Christianity from the Middle East, and now much more African and Asian. Similarly, I think subcontinental Muslims, Sunni Muslims, really look up to the Gulf region Arabs, particularly Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And what we are seeing right now is nothing short of an ideological earthquake. Right, it's not guaranteed it will succeed, but it seems like it will. I think there is an element of a Cousinets curve, a U curve, in the sense that when women get educated in Muslim families, there is an element of, you might find them to be politically more opinionated against quote unquote Hindutva, etc. But actually they're negotiating going out for employment or education within their conservative setups, right? So there is an element of a kind of a U curve here, and I'm very positive that eventually not just UCC, but even this broader problem of religious tensions in India will be solved, because it frankly seems like a literalist adherence to any religion, for that matter, really just does not get along with modernity. So people want to give it a chance, and eventually they realize it does not have the answers. If you had gone 200 years ago, 300 years ago in Europe, women were being burned, they were being called witches, they were being pagan witches, etc. Even in very early colonial United States, I think the Salem witch trials near Boston. It just depends on the time frame now. But as I said, I think this kind of pun intended small c Catholic Hindu idea is very much in consonance with modernity in a way that other ideas are not. This broad pagan polytheistic animist kind of culture has enough latitude to get all kinds of views inside in a way that more hard views are not.
Great. Harsh, honestly, it's almost 30 minutes past time and we still have everyone online. So that speaks to the volume of the interesting discussion that we've had and the foundation that we've laid for Long India. I'm sure I'm going to get comments, as I do normally for a lot of other speaker events for a round 2. So I personally really enjoyed this conversation. Honored to have this as my first event as the new president of CMU Mumbai. And for what I took away was just, keeping the snowball effect in mind. It's a slowly and then suddenly that happens in business, it happens in life. And, you and I both left the United States and came back to India. So, waiting for that snowball effect to kick in, and really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. Once again, congratulations on becoming president. And absolutely, I mean, I just conclude by saying that, we mentioned both of us having studied and left the US. I actually, in many ways, am an Americophile. I don't think this new confident India will not necessarily have a chip on his shoulder. There are many things to learn from the rest of the world. We must study the world. At the same time, where we disagree, we bring a unique perspective. So I just conclude by saying, to be a Vishwa Guru or like a global universal teacher, the first thing you must be is a Vishwa Shishya. So we must study the world beyond our shores. And I unfortunately think that is one place where we sometimes are just too complacent. We must study the broader world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Harsh. I will send you the recording and the feedback and everything else. And hopefully let's meet in person soon and hopefully do round 2 in a few months.
Absolutely. See you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.